The rebel forces struck shortly after the elections were held. In the summer of 1936, the right-wing party led by General Francisco Franco threw a coup d'etat against the recently established left-leaning government and resolved to take the entire country of Spain within weeks. However, despite the rebel army's intentions, the people soon rose to arms to slow their advance, thus starting a gruesome civil war. As young idealists watched and grew increasingly enraged, fascism quickly spread around the globe. And by December, hundreds of international volunteers would travel to the conflict zone to offer their service in favor of democracy. The Lincoln Battalion, made up of thousands of young American men and women, would risk their lives to defend a country that was not theirs, even at the risk of losing their citizenship while fighting fascism before World War II even started. Rising tides. It was the early 1930s, and the withdrawal of a monarch would seal the fate of an entire continent. An era had come to an end, and modernity called for a change in politics. When King Alfonso XIII abdicated to the Spanish throne, new horizons opened up for the country, which had been immersed in poverty and illiteracy, not to mention strict church dominance. The power void in Spain brought a glimpse of hope to its people, and a new republic that promised change and progress was born thereafter. A desperately needed land reform was instituted, and thousands of schools were built across many remote villages. Furthermore, women were more involved in politics and given the universal right to vote. Among many modern implementations, the Republic introduced the separation of the powers between the church and the state. However, so many abrupt changes also stirred deep sentiments among the population. Several open and violent confrontations between the left and the right ensued as a strong right-wing faction emerged. Together, the military, the Catholic Church, and the aristocracy would seek to reinvest the obsolete regime, an old order of power and privilege for the few. Soon, anarchists, socialists, and communists joined forces despite their differing views, as they now had a common cause: to stop fascism. As such, they pushed even harder for sweeping change. Meanwhile, on other fronts, Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, Hitler rose to power in Germany in 1933, and Italy assaulted Ethiopia in 1934, as Western governments overlooked the abuses of the expanding fascism. Then, in 1936, Spain held elections, and a Popular Front government emerged as the winner, chosen mainly by the leftist coalition, the peasants, workers, and middle class. This new government now posed a significant threat to the right, and that summer, the army, led by General Francisco Franco, rose up in arms against the legitimate rulers. The rebel leaders expected to take the whole country in a week, but they did not count on the fierce opposition from the population. Workers and peasants took to arms and slowed down the army's advance, while the loyalists, defenders of the Republic, barricaded Madrid and fortified the city under the motto "No pasarán," or "They shall not pass." Joining the fight. After the initial military coup failed to secure control of the country, a bloody civil war ensued. As Professor Robin D.G. Kelly of the University of California wrote, quote, "It is called a civil war, but this is really a misnomer. Without support from Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, and Portugal under the dictatorship of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, Franco and his rebel troops could not have succeeded." Within a week of the military uprising, the rebels had control of Spanish Morocco, the Canaries, and the Balearic Islands, except for Minorca. In addition, they held a significant part of the country to the north of the Ebro River, north of the Guadarrama Mountains, not including Asturias, Santander, and the Basque provinces to the north, and Catalonia to the northeast. In the south, the Republicans had quenched the uprisings in some areas, but not yet in the larger Andalusian cities of Seville, Granada, and Cordoba. Indeed, the fascist neighboring countries supported Franco's uprising and tilted the scale in favor of the right. In contrast, Western democracies further committed to their non-intervention policies, which intended to de-escalate the conflict, but only undermined the Spanish government by omission. In truth, the West's so-called neutrality quickly turned into an active embargo on the Republic, which further contributed to the unequal balance of power. On one side, the rebel nationalists would be supported by their fascist allies, who provided over 100,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, 3,000 pieces of artillery, and innumerable machine guns and other small arms. Above all, German and Italian modern air power was key in dismembering the resistance. And to make matters worse, American pirate corporations also contributed to the bulk of Franco's forces, like General Motors and Texaco, which assisted the future dictator with trucks and fuel. Meanwhile, only the Soviet Union and Mexico offered help to the Spanish government, but much of the armament sent to the Republicans was impounded at the French border. It was also the first time that the United States refused to sell arms to a legally elected government. Then, as their own ideals were threatened, many young Americans resolved to take a stand. As then soapbox speaker and later activist Milton Wolfe argued, quote, "The Spanish people have risen up and are resisting this. This is the first resistance to the march of Nazi aggression that has manifested itself. It has not happened in China, it has not happened in Africa, but the Spanish people are fighting back and they are winning. And with your help, with our help, we can defeat fascism in Spain. We can make Madrid the tomb of fascism." Idealism. One day after Christmas in 1936, 96 Americans sailed from New York to Spain, determined to support the democratic government. Eventually, no less than 2,800 volunteers made the bulk of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, the majority of which were merely students. The economic calamity and political turmoil of the 1930s fueled the volunteers' conviction to fight against fascism. During the Great Depression, many of them experienced deprivation and injustice firsthand, which might have led them toward communist-influenced movements. But as inspired as they were, the youngsters had no military training for the most part. Professor Kelly wrote, quote, "Most Lincolns were activists and idealists who had worked with and demonstrated for the homeless and unemployed during the Great Depression. They were poets and blue-collar workers, professors and students, seamen and journalists, lawyers and painters, Christians and Jews, blacks and whites. The brigade was the first fully integrated United States Army." Still, the brigade would face up against highly trained soldiers from the Spanish, German, and Italian armies, but fortunately, they were not alone. The Communist International Organization summoned volunteers from all over the world, and about 50 countries answered, with several international brigades then created. The French were the largest foreign group, with up to 28,000 fighters, but other nationals included Germans and Austrians, Polish, Italians, Czechs, and Belgians, and there were several British and Canadians besides the Americans. The first 100 volunteers that reached Spain in late 1936 were placed under the command of the Comintern. In total, 7 brigades were configured, each subdivided into battalions by nationality. The American units were the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, the George Washington Battalion, and the John Brown Battery. Together with other nationals, they formed the 15th International Brigade. The number of volunteers never exceeded 20,000 at any given time, but they totaled approximately 60,000 men, plus a small contingent of women. Other than soldiers, 125 Americans also contributed as medical workers, including nurses, doctors, technicians, and ambulance drivers. In spite of the odds, and the threat of losing their citizenship due to a State Department ban on travel to Spain, by January of 1937, hundreds of Americans crossed the Pyrenees on foot. What's more, they had to cross the border before daybreak or risk getting arrested by the French authorities. Many volunteers pretended to be students or tourists, while others were discreetly recruited as workers. Indeed, they came from all walks of life, but what they had in common was that most of them had never so much as held a gun before. Still, they would fight in every major battle of the war, the first of which took place in Jarama, a fierce encounter that inspired the battalion's infamous anthem, quote, "There's a valley in Spain called Jarama. It's a place that we all know so well. It is there that we gave of our manhood, and so many of our brave comrades fell." The People's Army. Self-motivated, the Lincolns strived to create an egalitarian People's Army. Traditional military protocol was shunned, though unsuccessfully. Officers distinguished themselves with small bars on their berets, and they were sometimes chosen by the soldiers. For roughly 2 months, the volunteers received training, with one of them recalling, quote, "They give me a gun, they give me 100 bullets, and they sent me to fight." At the Battle of Jarama, 470 Americans launched a futile assault against nationalist positions, and on their worst day in late February, there were 127 casualties and 200 wounded, including the commander, Robert Hale Merriman. Nevertheless, the battalion kept fighting and maintained its frontline positions. During the subsequent encounters, the battalion would suffer such heavy casualties that it had to be merged with the Washington Battalion. The Joint Battalion then saw action in a series of battles throughout 1937 and early 1938, enduring significant losses. In truth, the Lincolns suffered a higher casualty rate than the Americans suffered in World War II. Moreover, only a few escaped injuries. Over 50% were seriously wounded or perished in battle, while 750 men were lost. But despite the obstacles, the brigades operated effectively with what little experience they had, and the Republican Army imitated their performance. But as recruits diminished and the casualties mounted, the people were replaced, mainly by Spaniards, gradually erasing the international groups. By the end of its service, the Lincoln Battalion had helped ease the pressure on Madrid and had given the Republicans time to organize their own popular army. Back in America, the work of unmistakable voices like Ernest Hemingway also contributed to an anti-fascist wave throughout the country. Still, the Lincolns and the Republicans were no match against the mighty nationalist forces and could not withstand the fighting for long. Their last battle was at the Ebro Offensive in July of 1938. As a last resort, Spanish Prime Minister Juan Negrin ordered the withdrawal of the international brigades 4 months later in an effort to compel the Axis powers to repatriate their troops. But the coalition refused, and Madrid fell to the conservatives by March of 1939. A farewell parade for the volunteers was held in Barcelona shortly before the rebels overtook the remaining Republican strongholds in Catalonia. In her famous speech, politician Dolores Ibárruri told the retreating friendly soldiers, quote, "You are history, you are legend, you are the heroic example of solidarity and the universality of democracy." History judges. While the United States' official participation in World War II did not start until much later in 1941, Professor Kelly suggested that a more careful assessment of the origins of the war would mark the date about 5 years before. He added, quote, "If we understand World War II as a global struggle against fascism, then the conflict begins in Spain in 1936 with General Francisco Franco's army mutiny against the democratically elected Republican government. But those who dared rise against the conservative tide before the outbreak of World War II would be judged as premature anti-fascists. The role Americans played during the dire days of the Spanish Civil War was not precisely forgotten, but consciously erased. A noble example of solidarity, argued Kelly, was deliberately turned into a vile act of subversion, and the history of the Lincoln Battalion was forgotten. It is said that about 60% of its members were outspoken communists, but they are remembered as fighting against fascism on European soil before America's leaders were prepared to do the same. As Professor Kelly concluded, quote, "The heroic participation of the international brigades represents perhaps the greatest example of internationalism in the 20th century. They volunteered not only to defend one country, but to defend humanity." Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed this story, please give us a thumbs up. And don't forget to let us know your thoughts in the comments section and subscribe to all our Dark Documentaries channels for more history-inspired content. Stay tuned.